On a calm morning in 1945, a single Japanese bomb turned a floating city into an inferno hotter than a blast furnace, triggering a disaster calculated to sink her in minutes. Yet, she defied the laws of physics for one specific reason hidden deep within her steel bones. It was March 19, 1945, just 50 miles off the coast of Honshu, Japan. The steel deck of the USS Franklin trembled as flight crews prepared for the morning strike against the Japanese mainland. Lieutenant Commander Joseph O'Callaghan, the ship's Catholic chaplain, had been awake since '04, celebrating Mass in the dimly lit wardroom. Now, as dawn broke over the Pacific, he watched ordnancemen load massive Tiny Tim rockets onto Corsair fighters. These 11-foot rockets carried 500 pounds of high explosive, enough to crack a battleship's armor, and Franklin was about to be the first carrier to launch them in combat. What Father O'Callaghan did not know was that in less than 3 hours, his ship would become a floating inferno that defied every prediction of destruction. The USS Franklin was about to suffer damage that naval architects calculated would send any carrier to the bottom within minutes. She would lose over 800 men in an instant, yet against every law of naval warfare and every expectation of material science, she would survive. The reason for her survival had been built into her keel 5 years earlier in a Virginia shipyard by men who were told their innovations were impossible. The morning began with the routine tension of combat operations. Franklin had moved closer to Japan than any American carrier had dared, putting her well within range of land-based aircraft. Her captain, Leslie Garris, had pushed the ship forward aggressively to maximize the sortie rate of his aircraft. By '07, the deck was a choreographed dance of controlled danger. 31 aircraft sat with engines warming and propellers turning, while ordnancemen wrestled the experimental Tiny Tim rockets onto wing pylons. Below, in the hangar deck, 22 more aircraft waited, fully fueled and armed. It was the most vulnerable moment in carrier operations, with hundreds of tons of aviation gasoline and ordnance exposed on 2 decks simultaneously. At 7 minutes past 7, a lone Japanese dive bomber appeared through the clouds. Radar had missed it amidst the clutter of returning American planes. The pilot had perhaps 30 seconds to act, and in that half-minute, he released 2 500-pound armor-piercing bombs with devastating accuracy. The first bomb punched through the flight deck and detonated in the hangar deck. The blast wave, traveling at 26,000 feet per second, tore through the packed aircraft like a giant fist. Aviation gasoline ignited instantly, creating a fireball that engulfed everything within 50 feet. The explosion was so violent that it sent the number 1 elevator, a 47-ton steel platform, rocketing 400 feet into the air before it crashed back onto the deck. The second bomb hit aft among the aircraft warming up for launch, creating an instant holocaust. 31 fuel tanks exploded in sequence, creating a wave of flame that rolled across the deck. Pilots trapped in their cockpits had no chance, and their screams were lost in the roar of exploding fuel. What happened in the next 30 seconds determined whether Franklin would live or die. Fire spread with terrifying speed as gasoline from ruptured tanks ran into the ventilation ducts, pumping burning vapor throughout the ship. Heat ignited the ready ammunition, sending 20-millimeter rounds streaking through the smoke like deadly fireflies. Then, the Tiny Tim rockets began to ignite. These massive weapons were designed to burn at 5,000 degrees, and when the first one ignited, it shot across the deck like a meteor, punching through the steel plating of the island structure as if it were tinfoil. The flight deck became a killing ground where men died from fire, explosion, or the random trajectories of weapons designed to sink enemy ships.
Amidst this hell, individual acts of heroism began to stabilize the situation. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Jurica, the ship's navigator, emerged from the bridge to see the aft 2/3 of the flight deck turned into a sea of flame. He made the agonizing decision to order all personnel to abandon the aft deck and concentrate on saving the forward section, knowing it meant leaving wounded men behind to focus limited resources where they could make a difference. Deep below in the engineering spaces, Lieutenant Junior Grade Donald Gary faced a different nightmare. Smoke was pumping into the engine rooms through the ventilation system, threatening to suffocate the crew. In a conventional ship, they would have abandoned their posts, losing all power. But Gary remembered a theoretical possibility from the ship's construction specifications. He realized he could jury-rig the CO2 fire suppression system to pump breathable high-pressure air into the compartment, creating positive pressure to force the smoke out. With shaking hands, he converted a fire system into a life support system, clearing the air enough for his men to breathe. He made the decision to keep the engineering plant running, knowing that as long as Franklin had power, she had a chance. On the hangar deck, Father O'Callaghan had been blown off his feet and found himself lying in burning gasoline. The Jesuit priest, a former math professor, stood up in a steel box filled with flame where temperatures reached 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet looking at the overhead beams, he realized something impossible. The steel plates were glowing red, but they were not buckling. The ship's structure was holding. O'Callaghan began organizing survivors with the calm authority of a teacher, directing men to throw ammunition overboard and man the hoses. Survivors would later remember him as a medieval warrior priest, immune to fear, but O'Callaghan later admitted he was terrified. He kept moving because he saw that the ship was surviving fires that should have melted her. By 0730, the cruiser USS Pittsburgh had passed a tow line to Franklin, pulling her away from the Japanese coast at a painful 5 knots. The cruiser USS Santa Fe came alongside in a display of incredible seamanship, holding position against the burning carrier to rescue over 800 men. But at 0800, the situation looked hopeless. Franklin was listing 13 degrees, dead in the water except for the tow, and Radio Tokyo had already announced her sinking. Everyone watching believed they were witnessing the death agony of a great ship. They were wrong. Deep in the ship, Donald Gary and his team had restored steam to the forward boilers. At 0800, Gary reported to the bridge that he could make 2 knots. Captain Garris then made a shocking decision. He ordered the Pittsburgh to cast off the tow. Franklin would move under her own power. It seemed insane, but a moving ship could steer, and movement created wind to blow the smoke away. At 0812, the massive bronze propellers began to turn. The restoration of power transformed everything. The movement helped clear the smoke, and the list began to improve as engineering crews counterflooded compartments. Men who'd prepared to abandon ship returned to their stations. Even when a massive magazine explosion at 8:45 sent a fireball 500 feet into the air, the ship held together. The explosion should have broken the ship's back, but the special steel bulkheads channeled the blast upward instead of sideways. By noon, Franklin was making 15 knots, and by 1600, the major fires were out. The Holocaust was over. Franklin had survived, though at a staggering cost of over 800 dead or wounded.
The reason she survived lay in the vision of one man, Homer Lenoir Ferguson. Born in 1873 and educated in Glasgow under the Masters of Naval Architecture, Ferguson believed that a ship that sinks cannot complete its mission. As president of Newport News Shipbuilding, he championed the design of the Essex-class carriers with a radical idea: use armor as structure. Traditional designs treated armor as dead weight added to a hull, but Ferguson argued that if you used special treatment steel, or STS, throughout the ship, every plate would contribute to both strength and protection. STS was a nickel-chrome alloy that was tough enough to resist bomb fragments, but ductile enough to be used as structural beams. It was vastly more expensive, but Ferguson proved that using it would actually make the ship lighter and stronger. Ferguson also insisted on extensive compartmentalization and redundancy. While British carriers had armored decks that turned their hangars into ovens during fires, and Japanese carriers were essentially floating bombs with poor fire suppression, the Essex class was designed to take punishment. Franklin had multiple independent fire mains, so if one was cut, others could take over. She had hundreds of watertight compartments. Her survival was not luck. It was engineering. The data from Franklin proved that Ferguson's expensive steel and redundant systems had worked exactly as planned. The hangar deck plates had warped but not failed. The underwater protection system remained intact despite the internal explosions. Franklin traveled 12,000 miles home under her own power, arriving at the Brooklyn Navy Yard to become a floating laboratory for damage control experts.
Engineers spent months analyzing how the STS bulkheads had contained the blasts and how the fire mains had maintained pressure. This data, compiled in War Damage Report number 56, influenced every carrier designed thereafter. While Franklin herself was never fully repaired and was eventually scrapped in 1966, her steel was recycled, with legends saying some of it went into the USS Enterprise, the first nuclear carrier. The true legacy of the Franklin, however, was not the steel, but the lives it saved. The attack killed nearly 900 men, but the ship's survival saved 1,700 others. That ratio represented the return on investment for superior engineering. The expensive steel and the extra compartments bought those men their lives. Homer Ferguson never received a Medal of Honor, and his name is not on a warship. But every survivor who walked off the burning deck owed his life to the decisions Ferguson made in a drawing office years before the war. Lieutenant Commander O'Callaghan and Lieutenant Gary received Medals of Honor for their courage, but they knew that courage without a survivable ship is just martyrdom. As Donald Gary later wrote to a young officer, "Systems don't fail, people do. So you must build ships that can carry people when they are exhausted and terrified." Franklin was that ship. She refused to die, and in doing so, she brought 1,700 witnesses home to testify that engineering excellence is the highest form of protection we can offer those we send into harm's way.